He had already died once, torn apart by a god who did not consider humans worth the effort of a real fight. That memory sat behind his eyes every single day, and nobody around him had the faintest idea. 10 years earlier than he should have existed, a boy stood in a cracked stone courtyard, waiting to fail a test everyone expected him to fail. The instructor's name was Zakari, a long-range mage with silver hair combed too neatly and a voice built for talking down to people. He stood beside a block of black rock taller than a grown man, arms folded, already smiling the way people smile when they know the punchline before it lands. He told the row of first-year students that the rock in front of them was rated unbreakable by the Academy's own record books. He said no student below the rank of Elder Mage had ever cracked its surface. He said this while looking directly at the boy standing at the very end of the line, the one wearing the plain gray uniform of the Close Combat Department instead of the deep blue robes everyone else wore. Setsuna did not react to the stare. He had been stared at like that for weeks now, ever since he chose the one magic path that made nobles wrinkle their noses and long-range students snicker behind their hands. A girl near the front leaned toward her friend and whispered that the close combat boy was probably going to embarrass the whole department again. Her friend laughed quietly enough that a professor wouldn't hear, but loud enough that Setsuna did. He let it pass over him like weather. Long-range magic was the pride of the kingdom. Fireballs that could level a hillside, ice lances that could pin a monster from 300 feet away, lightning that arced across a battlefield without the caster ever breaking a sweat. That was what nobles paid tutors for. That was what songs were written about. Close combat was the department for students who couldn't manage a real spell. That was the polite version. The uglier version, the one said in hallways and dormitories, called it the trash class. A path for people whose mana pool was too small to matter, who had to get close enough to touch a monster before their magic did anything at all. Setsuna had chosen it on purpose. Zakari called the first student forward. A tall boy in blue robes stepped up, planted his feet, and unleashed a bolt of compressed wind at the rock. The stone barely shivered. Chalk dust sprayed off the surface and drifted down like snow. The boy stepped back, red-faced, and Zakari nodded like he expected nothing more. One after another, the students tried. A girl summoned 3 orbs of fire that scorched the rock black without denting it. Another boy carved shallow lines into the surface with a wind blade, thin as paper cuts, gone the moment he stopped chanting. Each failure made Zakari's smile a little wider, because each failure proved his point before he even had to say it out loud. Then he called Setsuna's name, and he said it the way a man says a joke he's been saving for the punchline. He asked, in front of the entire class, whether the close combat department even bothered teaching students how to punch correctly, or whether they simply hoped monsters died of secondhand embarrassment. A few students laughed. Not all of them. A red-haired girl standing near the back did not laugh at all. She watched Setsuna with something closer to worry than mockery, the kind of look someone gives a friend about to walk into a situation they don't deserve. Setsuna stepped up to the rock. He rolled his shoulders once, the way a man does before lifting something heavy, and settled his weight the way his old instructor from another life had drilled into him 1,000 times over. Because this was not his first time standing in front of an impossible obstacle. It was not even his first century of standing in front of one, not really, not counting the years compressed into memory that nobody else in this courtyard could see. He had watched cities burn. He had watched an entire continent turn to ash under the weight of one being's boredom. He had died with his back against a collapsed wall, his mana completely spent, his friends already gone, and the last thing he ever saw was a god's hand closing around his throat without the slightest effort. That death had bought him something. A cursed heirloom necklace, passed down through his family for generations, activated in his final second of consciousness, and dragged his mind backward through 10 years of time. Everyone else in this life had lived those 10 years once. He had lived them twice. He raised his fist. Zakari opened his mouth to say something else clever, something about form or technique, but he never got the chance. Setsuna's fist met the rock, and the rock did not survive the introduction. It didn't crack. It didn't split into 2 neat halves the way stories like to describe these things. It simply exploded outward in a spray of black shards and fine gray dust, the sound cracking across the courtyard like a whip, and when the dust settled there was nothing left where the rock had stood except a shallow crater and a few pebbles rolling to a stop. Nobody laughed this time. Zakari's mouth stayed open for a full 3 seconds before any words came out of it, And when they finally did, they weren't clever at all. He asked, quietly, "How?" Not mockingly, genuinely. Setsuna lowered his fist and said nothing. He'd had 10 years this time around to decide how much of the truth he was willing to share. The answer, so far, was almost none of it. The red-haired girl was staring at him now too, though her expression held none of the suspicion the other students wore. Her name was Isla, and she was one of the very few people in the entire close combat department who hadn't transferred out within the first month out of shame. She'd watched Setsuna train alone in the courtyard after dark more nights than she could count, throwing punches at nothing until his knuckles split, never once complaining that the department got the smallest training hall, the oldest equipment, the least respect from anyone wearing a professor's robe. She didn't know why he trained like his life depended on it. She just knew that it clearly did, to him. Setsuna walked back to his place in line, and behind him, whispers started up again, but they'd changed shape entirely. Nobody was laughing at the trash department anymore. A few students were already murmuring theories, each one wilder than the last, about hidden bloodlines or secret tutors or forbidden artifacts. None of them guessed the truth, because the truth was too strange to guess. The truth was that the boy standing quietly at the end of the line remembered dying, and remembered exactly which magic path had been useless against the thing that killed him. That was the whole reason he was here, wearing gray instead of blue. In his first life, Setsuna had been a long-range mage, a talented one even, climbing through the ranks of the Royal Mage Corps faster than most, throwing lightning and fire at monsters from a comfortable safe distance for years. It had worked, right up until the war that mattered. He remembered the day the sky over the capital turned the color of a fresh bruise, and something descended out of it that the scholars later called the evil god, though by then there was almost nobody left to write the histories down. Its name was Vidrak, and it did not fight like a monster. It fought like a being that considered the entire concept of losing beneath its notice. Every spell thrown at Vidrak simply came apart before it landed. Fireballs unraveled into harmless sparks a foot from his skin. Lightning bent around him like water around a stone. An entire formation of the kingdom's strongest mages unleashed everything they had in one coordinated assault, and every last drop of that magic dissolved into nothing against an aura none of them fully understood. Setsuna had been in the third line of that formation. He watched the first line die without landing a single hit. It was only near the very end, when a wounded close combat specialist crawled forward and drove a mana-infused blade into Vidrak's leg out of sheer desperation, that Setsuna saw something no one else seemed to register in the chaos. Vidrak bled. Just a little. Just enough. Nobody survived long enough afterward to spread that information anywhere useful. The specialist died seconds later, crushed without ceremony. Setsuna died shortly after that, his magic exhausted, his side torn open, his last coherent thought a furious, useless realization that the answer had been sitting in front of everyone the entire war, and nobody had thought to ask why the long-range strategy kept failing. The necklace had been his grandmother's, an old family relic nobody in his bloodline understood anymore, worn more out of sentiment than belief in old legends. In his dying breath, he'd gripped it out of pure instinct, some last animal desire to hold on to something familiar. It answered him in a way no one, least of all him, expected. He woke up 10 years younger, in his childhood bed, in an orphanage that no longer existed by the time he died the first time. He remembered everything: the war, the deaths, the shape of Vidrak's aura, the single, ugly truth that close combat was the one path that worked. He remembered his friends' faces in the moment before they stopped being alive, so this time, he chose differently. He walked past the recruiter for the long-range department on his first day at the academy, ignored the stares, and enrolled in the class that everyone else avoided out of pride. It had cost him, socially, more than he expected. Nobles who might have respected a promising fire mage looked straight through a close combat student like he was furniture. Professors assigned him to the smallest classrooms and the oldest, most battered training dummies. He ate alone more often than not during his first weeks, until Isla started sitting across from him without asking permission, simply setting her tray down and talking about nothing in particular until he answered back. She was the first person in this second life who treated him like a person and not a rumor. Word of the shattered rock spread through the academy faster than any official report could. By the time Setsuna reached his afternoon class, students from departments he'd never spoken to were finding excuses to walk past the close combat training hall, just to look in through the doorway. Drago Oak, the biggest student in the entire first-year class and the current representative of the close combat department, met him at the door with his arms crossed and an expression that wasn't quite a smile. He asked Setsuna, bluntly, whether the rumor was true, whether he'd really broken Zakari's unbreakable rock with one punch. Setsuna admitted that it was, without elaborating. Drago studied him for a long moment. He was nearly 2 heads taller than Setsuna, built like the giant enhancement skill he specialized in, and he'd held the top spot in the department without real competition since he first enrolled. He asked, evenly, whether Setsuna intended to challenge him for that spot. Setsuna said he hadn't thought about it. Drago laughed at that, a short, honest bark of a laugh, and said that was the correct answer, because he intended to make sure Setsuna thought about it very soon, in the training ring, where rumors didn't matter and fists did. It wasn't a threat exactly. It read more like an invitation from someone who'd been waiting years for a real opponent. That evening, in the courtyard behind the dormitories, Setsuna found Ila sitting on the low stone wall where she usually waited for him after his solo training sessions. She had a bruise forming along her jaw that hadn't been there that morning. He asked her what happened. She said it was nothing, in the tone people use when it is very much not nothing, and looked away toward the practice field, where a cluster of long-range students were laughing together near the fountain. He didn't press her immediately. He simply sat down beside her and waited, because he'd learned a long time ago, in a life nobody else remembered, that people told the truth on their own schedule, not yours. Eventually, she admitted that a group of second years from the enchantment department had cornered her near the Eastern Hall, calling her a disgrace to her family name for choosing close combat when her bloodline supposedly carried enough mana for something better. One of them had shoved her into the wall hard enough to split her lip before a professor happened to walk by and scattered them. Setsuna's jaw tightened, just slightly, and something old and dangerous surfaced behind his calm expression, something that had nothing to do with this life, and everything to do with watching people he cared about get hurt in the last one. He asked for names. Ila shook her head and told him it wasn't worth the trouble, that reporting it would only make her look weaker in front of people who already thought less of her. He didn't argue with her out loud. He simply filed the names away in his memory for later, the way he filed away everything useful, and told her instead that she wasn't a disgrace to anything, that the people who said so had never once faced what she faced every day just to keep showing up. She looked at him for a moment like she wanted to say something else, then didn't, and instead asked whether the rock story was true. He told her it was, and she smiled for the first time since he'd sat down, a small, tired smile that still managed to look genuine. She said that maybe, finally, the rest of the academy would stop looking at the close combat department like a punishment assignment. He didn't tell her that the rock had barely required effort on his part. He didn't tell her about the war, or the necklace, or the god with the bruise-colored sky behind him. Some truths, he'd decided, needed to wait until there was someone strong enough standing beside him to carry the weight of hearing them. For now, it was enough that she believed in him without needing the whole story. 3 days later, the bullying she'd described came back to bite the people responsible for it, though not in the way anyone expected. The academy held a mandatory sparring exhibition between departments twice a term, mostly for show, mostly so visiting nobles could watch their children perform. Drago had already claimed his match against Setsuna weeks in advance, unwilling to wait for an official tournament to settle what he considered unfinished business. The exhibition ring stood in the center of the academy's largest courtyard, ringed with stone benches that filled with students and a few visiting parents by the time the match was called. Zakari stood near the front row, arms crossed, watching with the particular attention of a man trying to disprove something he couldn't quite explain away. Drago entered the ring first, rolling his shoulders, his enhancement skill already humming faintly beneath his skin, turning his muscles harder and denser with every passing second. He'd earned the nickname Hercules among his classmates for a reason. He'd never lost a sparring match in his 3 years at the academy. Setsuna stepped in across from him without any visible preparation at all, hands loose at his sides, expression unreadable. Drago told him, not unkindly, that he respected whatever training let him crack that rock. But respect wasn't the same as backing down, and he intended to test that respect properly. Setsuna said that was fair. The referee called the start, and Drago closed the distance immediately, a wall of muscle moving faster than his size suggested it should, his fist already crackling with the enhancement skill's telltale shimmer. Setsuna didn't dodge. He stepped inside the punch instead, close enough that Drago's full swing lost most of its leverage and redirected the momentum with a small, precise shift of his own weight, the kind of movement that looked almost lazy from the outside and had taken him years, in another life, to make look that easy. Drago stumbled forward half a step, caught himself, and turned with visible surprise, crossing his face for the first time since the match began. He came at Setsuna again, faster this time, throwing a combination meant to overwhelm through sheer volume rather than finesse. Setsuna weathered the first 2 hits on his forearms, feeling the impact rattle up into his shoulders, and answered with a strike to Drago's exposed ribs that folded the bigger boy half over with a sharp exhale. The crowd went quiet in a way that felt different from the courtyard silence after the rock incident. That silence had been shock. This one carried something closer to reassessment. Drago straightened up slower than he'd gone down, one hand pressed briefly against his side, and looked at Setsuna with an expression that had lost every trace of condescension it started with. He asked how long Setsuna had actually been training, because nothing about that exchange matched a first year's experience. Setsuna told him the truth, or close enough to it to satisfy the question. He said he'd been training every day since before the academy accepted him, and he didn't plan on stopping just because someone finally noticed. Drago nodded slowly, wiped a thin line of blood from the corner of his mouth, and said that he was done underestimating him, then attacked again with none of his earlier confidence and all of his actual skill. The match ran longer than anyone expected, longer than any exhibition match had run that entire term. Both fighters trading real damage instead of the usual choreographed display the crowd had come to expect. Zakari, near the front, had stopped crossing his arms entirely, leaning forward instead with the focused attention of a man rewriting his own assumptions in real time. It ended when Setsuna caught Drago's final overextended swing, redirected it past his own shoulder, and used the bigger boy's own momentum to put him flat on his back in the dirt, with enough force to knock the wind fully out of him. The referee called the match. Drago lay there a moment longer than necessary, staring up at the sky, before letting out a breath that turned into a rough, disbelieving laugh. He said, from the ground, that he'd just lost his department's top spot to a first year who'd been enrolled less than 2 months, and honestly, he couldn't even be angry about it. Setsuna offered him a hand up. Drago took it. From the stone benches, the same second years who had cornered Ila days earlier sat very still, saying nothing at all, their earlier confidence nowhere in sight, now that the boy they'd dismissed had just publicly dismantled the department's strongest fighter in front of half the school. Ila caught Setsuna's eye from where she sat near the front, and the look on her face wasn't smug or vindictive. It was something quieter and warmer than that. The look of someone watching a person she'd chosen to believe in prove that belief hadn't been misplaced. Setsuna held that look for a moment before turning back to help Drago off the ground properly, because whatever else this life held for him, whatever war was still coming, whatever debt he still owed to people who hadn't survived the last timeline, this part of it, at least, felt like something worth protecting on its own. He didn't know yet how much that would cost him. He didn't know that the boy who would one day put a blade through everything he cared about was already walking the halls of this same academy, wearing a friendly smile and keeping a secret far darker than any regression. That would come later. For now, there was only the quiet satisfaction of a courtyard slowly changing its mind about what the gray uniform meant, and a girl with a healing lip watching him like he'd already become something worth watching. Zakari didn't let the matter rest as easily as the students did. 2 nights after the exhibition, he requested an audience with Headmaster Dan, the Academy's aging summoner and the closest thing the school had to absolute authority. He found the old man in his study, surrounded by shelves of bound contracts and dust-covered summoning circles, feeding scraps of dried meat to a small spirit fox curled on his desk. Zakari didn't waste time with pleasantries. He asked, directly, whether the headmaster had reviewed the reports about the first year in the close combat department, the one who'd shattered an unbreakable rock and then dismantled Drago Oak without a mark to show for it. Dan didn't look up from the fox right away. He said he'd read the reports twice. Zakari pressed further, asking what conclusion the headmaster had drawn, because his own instincts told him something about the boy didn't add up. No first year moved like that. No first year read an opponent's weight shift and answered it half a second before the opponent finished committing to the swing. That wasn't raw talent, that was experience, the kind normally carried by veterans 3 times his age. Dan finally set down the meat and looked at Zakari with an expression that gave nothing away. He said only that some students carried more history than their age suggested, and that history, when it belonged to someone else, was rarely his to share. Zakari didn't understand the answer, and Dan didn't offer to clarify it further, which told him almost as much as an outright confirmation would have. He left the study more unsettled than when he'd arrived, and for the rest of that week, he watched Setsuna's training sessions from a distance whenever his schedule allowed it, saying nothing, drawing his own quiet conclusions. Setsuna noticed the attention. He'd expected it, honestly. A veteran soldier learns quickly which eyes in a crowd are dangerous and which are simply curious, and Zakari's had shifted somewhere between the two since the rock incident. He decided it wasn't worth worrying about yet. Zakari suspected something unusual. He didn't suspect the truth, and the truth was strange enough that almost nobody would land on it by accident. The Academy's rumor mill, meanwhile, had already moved on to bigger news. The annual exchange tournament between the 5 major departments was scheduled for the following month, a formal competition that decided which department would represent the Academy at the kingdom-wide student exhibition in the capital. For close combat, a department that hadn't placed higher than last in 11 consecutive years, simply fielding a competent representative would have counted as a victory. Drago, freshly humbled and apparently unbothered by it, made the department's position clear during their evening training session. He told the assembled close combat students, all 19 of them, that their new representative would be the same first year who'd broken his nose's pride 2 nights earlier, and that anyone who had a problem with that could take it up with the training dummy shaped like his fist. Nobody objected. Ila caught Setsuna afterward, walking beside him back toward the dormitories under a sky just beginning to darken toward evening. She asked whether he was nervous about representing the entire department in front of nobles and rival schools. He told her honestly that nervous wasn't quite the right word. He'd stood in worse arenas than this one, against opponents that made a tournament bracket look like a children's game. What he felt instead was something closer to responsibility, a low, steady pressure to make sure that this time, the people standing beside him walked away from the fight instead of being carried away from it. She didn't fully understand the weight behind that answer, not yet, but she didn't press him on it either. She simply matched his pace and told him that whatever happened in that tournament, the department already considered the last 2 days a win they hadn't expected in years. Neither of them noticed the tall, easygoing boy watching them cross the courtyard from the shadow of the enchantment hall, a boy with an easy smile and kind eyes that every single professor in the academy trusted without question. He'd heard about the rock. He'd heard about the match against Drago, and unlike everyone else drawing quiet, harmless conclusions about a talented transfer student, he was already wondering, with far more interest than concern, whether this particular first year might turn out to be a problem worth watching closely. His name was Leo, and by the time anyone else in that courtyard learned what he truly was, it would already be too late to stop what he'd set in motion. That night, alone in his dormitory room, Setsuna sat on the edge of his bed and turned the old necklace over in his palm, tracing the worn engraving along its edge with his thumb, the way he did most nights before sleep. It was a habit left over from childhood, back when the pendant was just a keepsake from a grandmother he barely remembered, long before he understood what it was actually capable of. Beating Drago felt good. It felt necessary, even a small brick laid toward the wall he intended to build between his friends and everything he'd watched come for them the first time. But he knew, better than anyone in this world could know, that raw close combat skill alone hadn't been enough to save anyone in his last life. Skill closed distance. Skill won tournaments. Skill did not put a scratch on a being that unmade magic before it ever touched him. Only one thing had drawn blood from Vidrak in that final battle, and it wasn't technique. It was a kind of power the church had outlawed generations ago and never fully explained why. Whispered about in old libraries as ancient magic, the art of binding a contract with an elemental spirit, rather than simply channeling raw mana through a spell circle. He'd heard the rumors already, secondhand, through older close combat students who traded old stories the way soldiers trade scars. Somewhere in the mountains east of the academy, deep inside a dungeon most students were forbidden from entering without an escort, an elf witch was rumored to test anyone bold enough to seek her out, and those who passed her trials walked away with power the church pretended didn't exist. He didn't know yet if the rumor was true. He didn't know if she was even still alive, given how long the stories had apparently circulated, but he intended to find out, because tournaments and tuition and department pride meant nothing next to the shape he remembered a bruise-colored sky taking, and he refused to stand in a third line of a doomed formation ever again. He closed his hand around the necklace, closed his eyes, and let himself remember, just for a moment, the faces of people who hadn't made it far enough into this second chance to earn one. Then he set the memory down where it belonged, in the part of himself that fueled the work rather than the part that drowned in it, and went to sleep already planning which weekend he could slip away toward the eastern mountains without drawing questions he wasn't ready to answer. Outside his window, the academy settled into its ordinary nighttime quiet, oblivious to how little of it would stay ordinary for much longer. The exchange tournament arrived faster than the academy's rumor mill expected, and slower than Setsuna would have liked. 3 weeks of preparation had passed since the night he decided to chase down an elf witch's dungeon, and 3 weeks had produced nothing but a locked gate, a warning sign carved into old stone, and a schedule too packed with classes and training to attempt the climb properly. He'd settled for patience. Patience was a skill his past life had beaten into him thoroughly. The tournament grounds sat just outside the academy's eastern wall, a stone coliseum built centuries earlier for exactly this purpose, its stands already filling with students, visiting nobles, and a scattering of scouts from the Royal Mage Corps by the time Setsuna arrived with the rest of the close combat delegation. Drago walked beside him, arms crossed, scanning the crowd with the restless energy of a man who'd handed over his old title and still hadn't decided how he felt about it. He muttered that half the school showed up just to watch the trash department lose in front of an audience for once. Setsuna told him the other half showed up to watch them not lose, which was new and worth something on its own. Drago grunted, unconvinced, but didn't argue. Ila found them near the fighter's entrance, her hair pulled back for once instead of loose around her shoulders, a small satchel of healing salves slung across her back in case anyone needed it. She'd insisted on coming as unofficial support staff, since the department couldn't afford a real healer, and she refused to let Setsuna walk into 5 straight matches with nobody in his corner. She asked if he was ready. He told her he'd been ready for years, in a tone that made her tilt her head slightly, like she was starting to understand there was a second meaning buried under most things he said, even if she couldn't name it yet. The bracket had been drawn a week earlier and posted outside the main hall for anyone curious enough to look. Setsuna's first opponent was an enchantment mage named Joel, a wiry third year known across the academy for a signature technique nobody had beaten in 2 full seasons. Joel specialized in sand golems, dozens of them, animated from a portable satchel of enchanted grains he carried everywhere he went. His strategy never changed because it never needed to. Overwhelm an opponent with numbers faster than they could clear them, let the golems absorb every hit, and win through sheer attrition while barely lifting a finger himself. He found Setsuna near the practice yard an hour before the match, satchel slung casually over one shoulder, and offered him a smile that had no warmth behind it at all. He said he'd heard the stories about the rock and about Drago, and he wanted Setsuna to know, sincerely, that none of it would matter once the golems started piling up. He said close combat mages hit things one at a time. He had an army. Setsuna didn't respond to the taunt directly. He only asked how many golems Joel typically fielded in a single match. Joel, mistaking the question for nervousness, answered proudly that his record stood at 43 in one bout, and he intended to beat it today. Setsuna nodded, filed the number away, and walked off toward the fighter's tunnel without another word, leaving Joel slightly unsettled by how little the threat had landed. The match began the moment the referee's flag dropped. Joel didn't waste time with posturing. He upended his satchel across the arena floor in one smooth motion, and the sand answered him instantly, rising into humanoid shapes by the dozen, crude and grainy but solid enough to hit like a fist made of packed gravel. The crowd gasped as the count climbed past 20, then 30, a shifting wall of golems closing in from every angle at once. Setsuna didn't retreat. He dropped low instead, into the same stance his old instructor had drilled into him across 100 desperate battles in another life, and let the first golem come to him. He didn't dodge it. He met it, drove a single strike through its chest that scattered it into loose sand before it finished swinging, and used the momentum of that strike to carry himself directly into the second golem's path. The crowd's gasp turned into something closer to a rising murmur as he moved through the golems the way a man moves through tall grass, each strike economical, each step already positioned for the next opponent before the current one finished falling apart. Joel's confident expression cracked somewhere around golem number 20, the exact point where his crowd-favorite record should have started proving itself and instead kept collapsing into dust with barely a pause between hits. By golem 35, sweat had broken out across Joel's forehead. and he was pouring more mana into the satchel than he'd planned to spend this early, desperate to keep the numbers coming before the gap closed entirely. Setsuna reached him at Golem 41, stepping through the last two constructs like they were an afterthought, and stopped an arm's length away with his fist already raised. Joel threw up both hands out of pure instinct, and the golems he'd been so proud of finally ran out, the satchel hanging empty and useless at his side. The referee called the match without needing to ask either fighter anything further. Setsuna hadn't landed a single blow on Joel himself. He hadn't needed to. From the stands, Zachary watched with his arms folded so tightly his knuckles had gone pale, saying nothing, adding another data point to a theory he still couldn't fully articulate even to himself. Ila met Setsuna at the tunnel entrance with a wide grin and a canteen of water, telling him that was the fastest anyone had ever cleared Joel's golems in Academy history, possibly by a margin of several minutes. Setsuna drank the water and said the golems weren't the hard part. The hard part, he told her, quietly enough that only she heard it, was always whatever came after someone that predictable stopped being a threat, and something worse started paying attention instead. She didn't fully understand what he meant by that either, not yet, but she filed the comment away the way she'd started filing away most things he said that sounded like they came from somewhere older than his face suggested. His second match, 2 days later, against a long-range mage named Oktar, went very differently, and not in a way anyone in the stands found entertaining. Oktar had a reputation of his own, though a far uglier one than Joel's, whispered about more than spoken outright. He specialized in a poison-infused variant of standard ice magic, technically within tournament rules since the poison was non-lethal, though several past opponents had spent days in the infirmary recovering from exposure. What nobody outside his own department fully knew, until that afternoon, was that Oktar had grown bored of testing his poison only on opponents. Setsuna arrived at the arena early to stretch, and found Ila already there, kneeling beside a cluster of younger students near the practice benches. 3 children no older than 9 or 10 who'd apparently wandered in from the Academy's junior preparatory wing to watch the tournament. 2 of them were coughing badly, their skin faintly discolored along the backs of their hands, while a nervous instructor tried to calm them without drawing too much attention. Ila's expression had gone hard in a way Setsuna hadn't seen from her before. She told him, voice tight, that Oktar had been testing refined poison variants on stray animals for weeks, bragging about it to anyone who'd listen, and apparently hadn't stopped there. One of the coughing children admitted, shakily, that Oktar had offered them candied ice chips near the practice grounds that morning, calling it a harmless treat. Setsuna crouched down to the children's level, asked them gently how they felt, and listened without interrupting while they described a bitter aftertaste and a slow numbness spreading up their fingers. Something in his expression shifted while he listened, quiet and controlled, the same old, dangerous calm that had surfaced once before, over a split lip that wasn't his. He stood, told Isla to get the children to the infirmary immediately and to make sure the healers knew exactly what they'd ingested, and walked toward the fighter's tunnel without raising his voice even once. Oktar was waiting near the entrance, arms folded, wearing the easy confidence of someone who'd never once faced consequences for anything he'd done. He greeted Setsuna cheerfully, said he'd heard about the Golem massacre, and promised this match would end far less politely. Setsuna asked him, flatly, whether he'd given ice chips to children that morning. Oktar's easy grin flickered, just slightly, and he said it was only a small dose, barely enough to notice, and besides, nobody had proven anything yet. Setsuna said nothing further. He simply walked past him into the arena, and something in the set of his shoulders made Oktar's grin falter completely before the match even began. The referee dropped the flag. Oktar opened with a barrage of ice lances, laced faintly violet with poison, thrown from a comfortable distance the way long-range mages always fought, confident that no close combat opponent could close the gap before the first volley landed. Setsuna closed the gap before the first volley finished forming. He moved faster than he had against Joel, faster than he'd moved against Drago, covering the arena floor in a handful of strides that left afterimages in less trained eyes, and reached Oktar while the mage was still mid-incantation on his second volley. Oktar tried to throw up a defensive ice wall on pure reflex. Setsuna's fist went through it as though it were paper. He didn't finish the match quickly, the way he had with Joel. He held back just enough to make sure Oktar felt every single exchange, disarming him of his staff, breaking his concentration on 3 separate incantations in a row, and letting him understand, blow by blow, Exactly what it felt like to be on the receiving end of something, with no interest in being fair. When the referee finally called the match, Akhtar was on his knees in the dirt, one arm hanging wrong, staring up at Setsuna with the first genuine fear he'd shown all tournament. Setsuna leaned down close enough that only Akhtar could hear him, and told him, quietly, that if he ever tested anything on a child again, close combat wouldn't be the only reason he regretted it. He walked away without waiting for a response. The crowd didn't cheer as loudly after that match as they had after the first one. Something about the way it ended felt less like a spectacle, and more like a verdict, and even the students who'd shown up hoping to watch the trash department embarrass itself left the stands quieter than they'd arrived. Word of Akhtar's poisoned candy spread through the academy by nightfall, helped along by an infirmary healer who refused to stay quiet about 2 coughing children in her care. By morning, Akhtar had been quietly pulled from the remainder of the tournament pending a formal review, though the review, tellingly, moved slower than anyone found reassuring. Setsuna didn't dwell on it. He had 1 match left, and the opponent waiting for him in the final wasn't someone he expected trouble from at all, at least not the kind he was prepared for. Her name was Carol, a gentle, soft-spoken formation mage from the summoning department, well-liked by nearly everyone who'd ever shared a class with her. She'd made it to the final through careful, defensive play rather than raw aggression, and the general consensus around the academy was that she posed no real danger to a fighter who'd already dismantled a golem army and a poisoner in successive matches. The morning of the final, Ila found Setsuna near the fighter's entrance and mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Carol had seemed strange the past 2 days, distant, slower to smile than usual. A few of her friends in the summoning department had noticed it too, though nobody had connected it to anything specific. Setsuna filed that detail away without comment, the way he filed away everything that didn't sit quite right, and told Ila he'd keep an eye on it. He had no idea yet how right that instinct would turn out to be, or how close the final match would come to costing someone far more than a tournament trophy. The referee called both fighters to the center of the ring. Carol walked out slower than her usual pace, her eyes carrying a faint, glassy distance that made Ila's earlier comment click into sharper focus. Something about the way she moved didn't match the girl Setsuna had seen laughing with friends in the dining hall 2 nights earlier. He asked her, quietly, before the match began, if she was feeling all right. She answered in a voice slightly too flat for the words, telling him she felt wonderful, and that today would be a very memorable match for everyone watching. The flag dropped, and the memorable part started almost immediately. Carol's summoning circles bloomed across the arena floor in a pattern too precise for someone known for gentle, defensive formation work. Where her past matches had crept along cautiously, testing angles before committing, this Carol moved with a mechanical certainty that had nothing hesitant about it at all. 3 summoned constructs rose from the circles at once, stone-limbed and faceless, each one built for grappling rather than striking. They didn't come at Setsuna individually the way an opponent testing her nerve might send them. They came in a single coordinated pincer, closing every angle of retreat before he'd taken his second step. He noticed it immediately. Formation mages didn't fight like generals running battlefield calculations mid-match. Formation mages fought like formation mages, methodical and slightly stiff, relying on preset combinations they'd drilled for months. This was something else. This was someone else's mind directing Carol's hands. He didn't have time to solve that puzzle yet. He had time only to survive the pincer. He dropped beneath the first construct's grasping arm, rolled through the gap between the second and third, and came up already moving toward Carol herself rather than her summons, because ending the source of a formation always mattered more than exhausting himself against its output. Carol's flat, distant eyes tracked him with unsettling precision, and she raised both hands, weaving a 4th circle faster than any formation mage her age should have managed. Setsuna closed the last stretch of distance in a single hard burst of speed, close enough now that her constructs would need to risk hitting their own summoner to reach him, and Carol, or whatever was steering Carol, seemed to calculate that risk instantly, pulling all 3 constructs back into a defensive ring around her instead. That hesitation told him something useful. Whoever controlled this puppet still valued the body wearing it enough to protect it. That was a weakness, thin as it was, and he intended to use it. He feinted left, drawing 2 of the constructs to shift and cover the angle, then reversed direction hard enough to wrench his own footing, driving directly at the gap the shift had opened. Carol's 3rd construct lunged to intercept, too slow by half a second, and Setsuna's palm strike caught it dead center in its stone chest, shattering the summoning matrix, holding it together into a scatter of harmless motes. The crowd, silent through most of the exchange, finally found its voice again, a rising murmur of confusion and excitement tangled together, because nobody watching had ever seen the gentle formation mage from the summoning department fight like this, calculating and merciless, and stranger still, nobody had seen a first-year read her strategy fast enough to start unwinding it in real time. 2 constructs left. Carol backed toward the arena wall, her flat expression never once cracking into strain or effort the way a genuinely tired fighter's would. Setsuna pressed the attack, forcing her retreat into a corner, watching her hands for the telltale hesitation of someone running low on mana. It never came. Whatever powered this performance clearly wasn't drawing from Carol's own limited reserves the normal way, which meant time wasn't on his side the way it usually was against an exhausted opponent. He needed to end this differently. An idea surfaced from somewhere old, a technique he'd only ever attempted once in his last life, half-formed and unfinished, born from watching close combat veterans compress raw mana into a single condensed strike instead of bleeding it out gradually through a dozen smaller hits. He'd never had the control to pull it off properly back then. He'd had 10 more years of quiet, obsessive practice since. He dropped his stance low, gathering every scrap of mana he could funnel through his arm without losing his footing, compressing it tighter and tighter into a point no larger than his knuckles, the air around his fist visibly warping under the pressure. Carol's remaining constructs surged forward together, sensing the buildup and moving to smother it before it finished forming. Setsuna let them come almost all the way in, waiting until the very last fraction of a second the gap allowed, and then released everything he'd gathered in one focused, explosive burst aimed not at the constructs but straight through the narrow seam between them, directly at the summoning circle glowing faintly beneath Carol's feet. The strike didn't look impressive from the stands. It looked like a single fast punch, unremarkable next to the earlier spectacle of 40 exploding golems. But the circle beneath Carol shattered instantly, along with whatever thread of foreign will had been running through it, and both remaining constructs dissolved mid-motion, their animating force cut off at the source. Carol staggered, blinked hard twice, and the glassy distance behind her eyes cleared all at once, replaced by wide, disoriented confusion as she looked around the arena like she'd just woken up somewhere she didn't remember falling asleep. She asked, voice shaking, what had happened and why everyone was staring at her like that. The referee, equally confused but professionally obligated to finish his job, called the match in Setsuna's favor, though the announcement landed with none of the triumphant weight a tournament final usually carried. Setsuna reached Carol before anyone else did, steadying her by the shoulder as her knees threatened to give out, and asked gently what she remembered from the last few minutes. She said only fragments, a cold, distant feeling, like watching her own hands move from somewhere far away. A voice that wasn't hers, calm and pleasant, telling her the match would be memorable. Then nothing, until his fist broke whatever held her. Ila reached them a moment later, already calling for a healer, and helped guide Carol toward the infirmary bench set up along the arena's edge. Zakari arrived at the ring's edge almost as quickly, his earlier suspicion about Setsuna momentarily forgotten in the face of a much stranger, much more urgent problem. He asked Setsuna directly what he thought he'd just witnessed. Setsuna chose his next words carefully. He said someone had been controlling Carol from a distance, using her own summoning circle as a channel, and whoever it was had let go the instant the circle broke. Zakari's expression darkened considerably. He said mind-affecting magic of that kind was outlawed by both the Crown and the Church for good reason, and if someone inside this academy had used it on a student during a sanctioned tournament, the headmaster needed to know immediately. Setsuna agreed, though privately, a colder thought had already settled in his chest, one he didn't share out loud yet. Controlling a student mid-match, in full view of nobles and scouts, wasn't the kind of risk an ordinary rival or bully would take for petty advantage. It read like a test, like someone probing exactly how Setsuna handled pressure, and exactly how fast he solved problems nobody else in the arena could even see. He scanned the crowd out of old habit, the way he used to scan a battlefield for the one enemy who mattered more than the rest, and found nothing obviously wrong. Just students, nobles, scouts, professors, all of them talking over each other about the strangest tournament final anyone could remember. Somewhere in that crowd, though, someone was smiling in a way nobody else noticed, pleased with exactly how well the experiment had gone, already thinking ahead to how much more interesting things would get once Setsuna stopped being merely talented and started being useful. Isla found him again near the fighter's tunnel an hour later, Carol resting comfortably under a healer's care, the immediate crisis handled if not fully explained. She asked if he was all right, since he'd gone quiet in a way that worried her. He told her he was fine, and that winning a final under those circumstances didn't feel like much of a win at all. She didn't have an answer for that, so she simply stayed beside him instead, which turned out to be exactly the kind of answer he needed most. Neither of them noticed, this time either, the easygoing boy standing near the Colosseum's upper tier, watching the whole aftermath unfold with quiet, careful interest, already deciding that the moment for introductions was coming sooner than he'd originally planned. Headmaster Dan convened a private meeting that same evening, in a smaller chamber off his main study, with only Zakari, the tournament referee, and 2 senior professors from the summoning department in attendance. Setsuna wasn't invited, though word of the meeting's contents reached him anyway, filtered through Ila, whose aunt worked as a scribe for the Academy's administrative office. The consensus apparently was troubling and thin. Carol's own memory offered nothing usable. The summoning circle she'd used had been inspected afterward and showed no trace of tampering beforehand, which meant whatever had seized control of her had done so mid-match, live, through a channel none of the senior professors could identify. That kind of range and precision belonged to magic well beyond a student's capability, mind-affecting sorcery so heavily restricted that most academy professors had only read about it in banned theoretical texts, never seen it applied. Zakari argued, according to Ila's aunt, that the timing couldn't be coincidence. Someone had chosen the final match, chosen Carol specifically, and chosen a moment where Setsuna would be forced to solve an impossible problem in front of the entire academy. He called it a test. Nobody in the room fully disagreed with him, though nobody offered an alternative explanation either. Headmaster Dan ordered increased security around the tournament grounds and, more quietly, around the infirmary, where Carol remained overnight for observation as a precaution. He said little else, according to the second-hand account, though Isla's aunt mentioned he'd looked, for the first time in her years working there, genuinely unsettled. Setsuna spent that night the way he spent most nights lately, sitting on the edge of his bed with the old necklace in his palm, turning the day's events over in his mind, with the methodical patience of someone who'd learned the hard way that missing a small detail could cost everything. Someone inside or connected to this academy had commanded mind-affecting magic strong enough to override a formation mage's own will from a distance, in the middle of a monitored, sanctioned event, without leaving a single physical trace behind. That wasn't the work of a jealous rival or a bored noble looking to embarrass the trash department. That was the signature of something with resources and training far beyond a student's reach. He thought about the war he remembered, the 12 servants the histories eventually named the Apostles, each one carrying a fragment of Vidrak's own terrible authority, each one capable of things ordinary mages could never match. He hadn't expected to find one of them this early, this close to home, this quietly embedded inside a school full of children. He told himself it was too soon to be certain. He told himself the thought anyway, because 10 years of hindsight had taught him that ignoring the worst possibility was exactly how the worst possibility always won. Near midnight, unable to settle, he left his dormitory and walked the quiet path toward the infirmary, telling himself he only wanted to check that Carol was resting comfortably, that the guards Dan had promised were actually in place. It was, he admitted to himself somewhere along the walk, only half the truth. The other half was an old soldier's instinct that refused to sit still while something dangerous remained unaccounted for. The infirmary sat at the edge of the academy's medical wing, a low stone building with a single lantern burning near the entrance. The guard who should have been posted at the door was nowhere in sight. Setsuna's pace quickened without conscious decision, old reflexes taking over before his thoughts fully caught up. He found the guard first, slumped against the outer wall in the shadow of a supply shed, unconscious but breathing, a thin trickle of blood at his temple from what looked like a single, precise blow. He didn't call out. Calling out would only warn whoever had done this. He moved instead, silent, along the wall toward Carol's window, the same careful, economical movement that had carried him through 40 golems and a poisoner's ambush. Through the narrow infirmary window, lit only by the faint glow of a single healing lamp, he saw a familiar figure standing over Carol's sleeping cot, hood drawn up despite the mild night air, one hand hovering inches above her chest with something small and sharp glinting between his fingers. Setsuna didn't hesitate. He went through the door instead of the window, the old wood splintering under a single kick, and closed the distance before the figure had fully turned to face the sound. The figure's hood fell back in the same motion that spun him around to meet the threat, and the face beneath it was one Setsuna had eaten breakfast beside just that morning, laughed with in the dining hall 100 times over the past weeks, trusted without a second thought since the very first day they'd met. Leo's easy, familiar smile was gone entirely, replaced by something cold and patient that had never once shown itself in all the time Setsuna had known him, and in his raised hand, the small glinting object resolved into a thin ceremonial blade, dark along its edge with something that wasn't ordinary poison. He tilted his head slightly, studying Setsuna with the mild curiosity of someone whose plans had shifted only slightly rather than failed outright, and said, in a voice that still somehow carried the same friendly warmth as always, that he supposed introductions were happening a little earlier than intended. Setsuna didn't answer him with words. He closed the last few feet between them in a single stride, aiming a strike meant to knock the blade clear before Leo could finish whatever he intended with it, the same economical motion that had carried him through an entire tournament without taking a serious hit. Leo caught his wrist before the strike landed. Not blocked, caught, cleanly, the way an adult catches a child's swing, and the grip that closed around Setsuna's forearm carried a strength that had nothing to do with the wiry, easygoing frame Leo had worn every single day since they'd met. Setsuna's mind raced through the discrepancy even as his body reacted on pure instinct, twisting free of the grip with a technique that should have broken any normal hold. Leo let him go a half-second before the technique would have worked, almost lazily, like releasing a toy rather than losing a grip. He said, conversationally, that Setsuna's reflexes really were impressive for someone this young, and that he'd genuinely enjoyed the past few weeks of pretending not to notice. Setsuna didn't waste breath on questions. He drove forward again, low and fast, aiming for the ribs this time instead of the weapon hand, a strike that had ended matches against opponents twice his size. Leo sidestepped it without appearing to move quickly at all, the kind of effortless evasion that came from a speed advantage so total it made effort unnecessary, and answered with a light, almost gentle tap to Setsuna's shoulder that sent him stumbling 3 full steps sideways into the infirmary wall hard enough to crack the plaster. Pain flared bright and immediate through his shoulder, and Setsuna understood, with the flat clarity of a soldier recalculating a battle he was losing, that whatever Leo actually was, it existed on a different scale entirely from anything he'd faced inside this academy so far. He pushed off the wall anyway, because retreating meant leaving Carol undefended, and some decisions weren't decisions at all, just reflexes worn into a person by everything that had come before. Leo watched him get back up with an expression that held something close to admiration, tilting his head slightly, and said it was a shame, genuinely, that timing had forced his hand this early, because he'd been curious to see how far Setsuna's little regression trick could actually carry him, given a few more years to develop. The word landed like a blow of its own, regression. Setsuna froze for half a heartbeat, just long enough for something in his expression to confirm the guess Leo had apparently only been testing aloud. Leo's easy smile returned briefly at that confirmation, colder now than it had ever looked across a dining hall table, and he said that explained quite a lot, actually. The fighting instincts too seasoned for a first year, the wariness that never quite matched a normal teenager's carelessness. He said he'd wondered, once or twice, whether Setsuna simply had good tutors. The truth, apparently, was more interesting. Setsuna asked, voice low, what Leo actually was. Leo's smile widened slightly at the question, and he said that particular answer would mean far more to Setsuna in a year or two than it would tonight, so he saw no reason to spoil the reveal early. He said instead that the girl on the cot behind him had served her purpose already, and finishing what he'd started here wasn't strictly necessary anymore, not with a more interesting complication currently standing in his way. He stepped forward, unhurried, the ceremonial blade still loose in his hand, and Setsuna braced for another exchange he already suspected he couldn't win. The infirmary door slammed open a second time before either of them moved again, and Headmaster Dan filled the doorway, his usually mild expression replaced by something Setsuna had never once seen on him, ancient and furious and utterly without hesitation. A summoning circle bloomed beneath Dan's feet before he'd finished a single spoken syllable, and the spirit fox from his study leapt out of it grown to 3 times its normal size, fangs bared, already lunging for Leo with a speed that matched, maybe even exceeded, whatever inhuman quickness Leo had shown moments earlier. Leo's expression shifted for the first time since the hood had fallen, calculation replacing amusement, and he threw himself backward through the shattered infirmary window rather than meet the fox head-on, landing outside in a low crouch before straightening unhurried, like a man stepping out of an inconvenient meeting rather than fleeing a fight. He looked back through the broken window one last time, found Setsuna's eyes, and said, almost gently, that he looked forward to their next conversation, whenever the timing suited them both better. Then he was gone, over the courtyard wall in a single impossible leap, and the night swallowed him whole before Dan's fox even finished clearing the window frame. Dan called the fox back with a sharp word, and it shrank down to its usual size and trotted obediently to his side, ears flat, clearly displeased at losing its prey. Silence settled over the wrecked infirmary room, broken only by Carol's soft, unconscious breathing, undisturbed through the entire exchange, thanks to whatever sedative the healers had given her earlier that evening. Dan crossed to Setsuna's side first, checking the bruising already spreading across his shoulder with quick, practiced hands, and asked, evenly, how badly he was hurt. Setsuna said he'd live, and asked, in the same breath, how the headmaster had known to come. Dan's expression flickered, old guilt surfacing briefly, before he smoothed it back into calm authority. He admitted that he'd placed a ward on the infirmary door earlier that evening, quietly, without telling the posted guard, because something about the mind control incident during the tournament had unsettled him enough to take precautions he hadn't fully explained even to Zakari. The ward had triggered the moment the guard fell unconscious outside. Setsuna asked if Dan knew what Leo actually was. Dan didn't answer immediately. He knelt instead beside Carol's cot, checking her pulse with the same quick efficiency he'd used on Setsuna's shoulder, and only once satisfied she remained unharmed did he straighten and meet Setsuna's eyes directly. He said the word apostle carefully, like something dangerous even to speak aloud, and told Setsuna that the church's oldest banned texts described 12 such servants, each bound to the evil god through a fragment of divine authority, each one capable of things no trained mage, however gifted, could hope to match without help. Setsuna's stomach turned cold at the confirmation, though some part of him had already known, had known since the moment Leo's grip closed around his wrist with strength that had no business belonging to a teenage boy. He asked how Dan knew so much about a subject the church supposedly kept locked away from public knowledge. Dan's answer came slow and deliberate, weighted with decades he clearly hadn't planned on discussing tonight. He said that summoners, more than any other discipline, kept old libraries alive precisely because contracts required understanding the true nature of whatever a summoner intended to bind, and some of those libraries held fragments of history the church had tried, and largely succeeded, in erasing from common record. He said the apostles were real, had been real for longer than anyone currently alive fully understood, and that finding one hiding inside his own academy, wearing the face of a well-liked ordinary student, troubled him more deeply than he was willing to show in front of a first year, however unusual that first year turned out to be. Setsuna decided, standing in the wreckage of a shattered infirmary window with a wounded shoulder and a girl still sedated on the cot behind him, that half-truths had run their course. He told Dan everything. He told him about the future he remembered, the sky the color of a fresh bruise, the god named Vidrak who unmade every spell thrown at him before it ever landed close enough to matter. He told him about the war's final formation, the third line he'd stood in, the specialist who'd bled the only wound anyone managed to land that entire battle with a close-range blade. He told him about dying with his side torn open and his magic spent, and waking up 10 years younger with a grandmother's necklace clutched in his fist and a truth in his memory that nobody else in this timeline had ever lived long enough to learn. Dan listened without interrupting once, his expression cycling slowly through disbelief, then something closer to grim recognition, and finally a heavy, weary acceptance that settled over his features like an old coat he'd worn before. When Setsuna finished, Dan was quiet for a long moment, studying him with new eyes, seeing perhaps for the first time the full weight the boy in front of him had been quietly carrying since the day he first refused a long-range recruiter's offer. He said, finally, that such stories existed in old summoner lore too, rare fragments describing beings who carried memory across broken timelines, though he'd never expected to meet one wearing the face of a 15-year-old close combat student. Setsuna asked if Dan believed him. Dan gestured, without much humor, toward the shattered window, the unconscious guard being carried inside by two arriving healers, the spirit fox still pacing near his feet, with its hackles only partly settled. He said the events of tonight alone offered more evidence than most claims ever received, and besides, he added, quieter now, a man his age learned to trust his instincts about people, and his instincts about Setsuna had never once suggested deception. He asked what Setsuna intended to do with the knowledge he carried. Setsuna answered without hesitation, because it was the one question he'd already answered for himself 1,000 times over, alone in his room, staring at an old necklace that had cost him everything to earn a second chance. He said he intended to find every advantage this timeline offered that his first life never found in time, gather whatever power could actually hurt something like Vidrak, and make sure the people he cared about walked away from the coming war instead of dying in it. Dan studied him a moment longer, then nodded slowly, the decision settling behind his eyes with the finality of a man who'd made up his mind and didn't intend to revisit it. He said the Academy would need to handle tonight's incident carefully, publicly framing it as an attempted assault by an unidentified intruder, rather than naming a well-liked student as one of the evil god's own servants, at least until they understood the full scope of what they were dealing with. He said panicking the student body, or worse, tipping off however many other apostles might be watching from elsewhere, would help nobody. Setsuna agreed, though the thought of Leo walking free through the same halls, laughing with classmates who had no idea what wore his face, sat like a stone in his chest. Dan added, before dismissing him to the healers waiting to check his shoulder properly, that Setsuna's secret would remain exactly that, a secret, shared with no one else inside the Academy without his express permission, and that whatever resources the headmaster's office could quietly offer toward preparing for the war ahead, Setsuna need only ask. It was, Setsuna realized as he finally let a healer examine the bruise spreading across his shoulder, the first time since waking up in his childhood bed that another adult in this timeline had looked at him and seen the full truth of who he actually was, rather than a talented, strange first year with more skill than his age accounted for. It felt, oddly, like setting down a weight he hadn't fully realized he was still carrying alone. News of the infirmary attack spread through the Academy by breakfast, exactly as carefully shaped as Dan had promised. An unidentified intruder, the official story went, had attempted to harm a recovering student overnight before being driven off by the headmaster's own summoned spirit. Setsuna's involvement went unmentioned entirely, and Leo's absence from morning classes drew only mild concern, quickly explained away by an administrative note claiming a sudden family emergency had called him home for an indefinite period. Ila found Setsuna at breakfast, noticed the careful way he favored his left shoulder, and asked what had happened. He told her, honestly as he could manage without revealing everything Dan had asked him to keep quiet, that he'd heard a disturbance near the infirmary the night before and gone to investigate, finding more trouble than he expected waiting for him there. She studied him for a long moment, clearly aware there was more to the story than he was sharing, and to her credit, didn't push. She simply reached over and refilled his cup without being asked, the small, steady kindness of someone who'd decided, somewhere along the past few weeks, that trust didn't always require full explanations. Drago joined them a moment later, still nursing his own bruises from the tournament weeks earlier, and asked, half joking, whether the trash department was cursed to attract every strange incident happening at the Academy this term. Setsuna managed a thin smile at that, and said it was starting to feel that way. None of them mentioned Leo's name over breakfast, though his empty seat 2 tables over sat noticeably unoccupied, and more than a few students glanced toward it throughout the morning with quiet, unspoken questions nobody quite knew how to voice. Setsuna caught himself glancing that way too, more than once, remembering a night not so long ago when he'd sat across from that same easy smile and felt, for the first time since waking up in this second life, something close to ordinary friendship. He wondered how much of it had ever been real, and suspected, with a cold certainty that settled somewhere behind his ribs, that he already knew the answer. That weekend, with classes suspended for a scheduled academy holiday and no tournament matches left to occupy him, Setsuna finally made the trip he'd been delaying since the night he first heard the old rumors about an elf witch's forbidden trials. The path east led up through dense forest and increasingly rocky terrain, climbing steadily toward mountains the Academy's maps marked only with a faded warning symbol and no further detail. Drago had offered to come along after hearing a heavily edited version of Setsuna's plans, insisting that whatever waited up there, a first year shouldn't face it alone, and Hila had insisted just as firmly on packing enough healing salves for a small army. The three of them reached the dungeon's entrance by early afternoon, a narrow crack in the mountainside barely wide enough for one person at a time, guarded by nothing more than an old iron gate and a warning sign so weathered its original words had faded into illegible scratches. Drago eyed the gate skeptically and asked whether Setsuna was entirely certain rumors from older close combat students counted as reliable information. Setsuna admitted they didn't, not really, but said it was the only lead he had toward power that might actually matter against what was coming. And that made it worth the climb, regardless of how thin the rumor turned out to be. Hila pushed the old gate open before either of the boys could second-guess themselves further, the rusted hinges groaning loud enough to echo off the mountainside, and the three of them stepped into darkness that smelled faintly of old moss and something else beneath it. Something that prickled at the back of Setsuna's neck with the particular unease of magic, far older than anything the Academy's classrooms ever taught. The tunnel sloped downward for what felt like a quarter-mile, narrow enough in places that Drago had to turn sideways to fit his shoulders through, before opening abruptly into a cavern lit by clusters of pale, faintly glowing fungus growing along the walls and ceiling. The light cast everything in a soft blue-green wash, enough to see by without ever feeling like real daylight. Hila kept close to Setsuna's side, her healing satchel gripped tight, eyes scanning the shadows between fungus clusters with the wary attention of someone who'd read enough dungeon survival manuals to know decorative light rarely meant a friendly space. Drago led the way forward regardless, his enhancement skill already humming faintly beneath his skin. The same restless confidence he carried into every sparring match now aimed at whatever waited in the dark ahead. They found the first sign of danger less than 100 yards further in. Three low, hunched shapes crouched around a pool of still black water, pale-skinned and hairless, with elongated limbs that scraped the cavern floor as they moved. The creatures hissed in unison the moment Drago's boots crunched against loose gravel, twin rows of translucent teeth catching the fungal light. Drago didn't wait for a plan. He charged the nearest one with a shout that echoed off the cavern walls, enhancement skill flaring bright along his forearms, and caught the creature mid-lunge with a haymaker that sent it sprawling into the black water with a wet, ugly splash. The other two scattered sideways instead of retreating, flanking wide in a move too coordinated for simple animal instinct, and Setsuna moved to intercept the one angling toward Hila before it closed the distance. He met it low, driving a palm strike into its narrow chest that folded it backward with a sound like snapping kindling, and it collapsed motionless before it finished falling. The third creature, seeing both companions already down, hesitated at the water's edge, hissing low and uncertain, before Drago finished it with a second swing that ended the standoff entirely. Silence returned to the cavern, broken only by the faint drip of water somewhere deeper in the tunnel network ahead. Hila let out a slow breath and admitted, half laughing despite the tension, that the manuals she'd read hadn't exaggerated nearly as much as she'd hoped they had. Setsuna checked the fallen creatures briefly, noting the same pale, translucent quality to their skin that suggested they'd never once seen actual sunlight, likely bred or twisted by whatever old magic still lingered this deep beneath the mountain. He filed the detail away, the way he filed away everything useful, and gestured for the group to keep moving before more of them noticed the disturbance. They pressed deeper for another hour, the tunnel branching twice before settling into a single wide passage that sloped gently downward, the fungal light growing steadily brighter the further they went, until it opened at last into a vast cavern chamber unlike anything the narrow tunnels leading to it suggested. The chamber ceiling arched high enough to lose in shadow, supported by natural stone pillars wrapped in centuries of vine growth, despite the total absence of sunlight this deep underground. At the chamber's center stood a small, tidy cottage, built entirely from packed earth and river stone, warm lantern light glowing behind its single round window, utterly incongruous against the wild caverns surrounding it. Drago stopped dead at the sight of it and asked flatly whether either of his companions found a cottage buried under a mountain even slightly reassuring. Before Setsuna could answer, the cottage door creaked open, and a figure stepped out onto the small dirt path leading toward them, moving with the unhurried grace of someone who'd expected visitors for quite some time. She looked young at first glance, a slender woman with silver hair braided over one shoulder and pointed ears unmistakably elven, dressed in simple traveling clothes that looked more suited to a forest trail than a cave 300 feet underground. Only her eyes gave away the deeper truth, pale gold and ancient in a way no youthful face should carry. the eyes of someone who'd watched centuries pass the way ordinary people watch seasons change. She studied the three of them for a long, silent moment, gaze lingering longest on Setsuna, before she spoke, her voice carrying an unhurried, musical quality that made even simple words sound like the opening line of an old story. She said it had been quite some time since anyone brave enough, or foolish enough, had made it this far past her wards, and asked which one of them intended to explain why 3 academy students had come knocking on a 300-year-old witch's front door. Setsuna stepped forward first, introducing himself and his companions, and admitted plainly that he'd come chasing a rumor about forbidden spirit contracts, in hopes it turned out to be more than just a story traded between bored close combat students. The witch's expression shifted slightly at that, something sharper than simple curiosity flickering behind her golden eyes. She said her name was Morgana, and that the rumor, unfortunately for the church that had spent 3 centuries trying to bury it, happened to be entirely true. Drago muttered under his breath that he'd half-hoped it wasn't. Morgana ignored him, studying Setsuna instead with the unhurried patience of someone who'd long since stopped being impressed by youthful confidence alone. She asked why a first-year academy student, barely into his own magic path, believed himself ready for a contract that had broken stronger, more experienced mages than him across the centuries she'd guarded this place. Setsuna considered his answer carefully, aware that whatever he said next would likely determine whether this entire climb had been worth the effort at all. He told her, honestly, that he wasn't asking because he believed himself ready. He was asking because a war was coming that would make readiness irrelevant, and he intended to gather every scrap of power available before that war arrived, rather than discover too late that he should have started sooner. Morgana's gaze sharpened further at the word war, something old and wary surfacing behind her ancient eyes. She asked what war a first-year student could possibly know about, that the kingdom's own scholars and generals apparently didn't. Setsuna hesitated only briefly before deciding, much the way he'd decided with Headmaster Dan days earlier, that half-truths had stopped serving him well. He told her about the bruise-colored sky, about a god who unmade every spell before it landed, about the apostles who served him, and the one he'd already unmasked hiding inside his own academy wearing a friend's familiar face. He didn't tell her about the regression itself, not yet. Some old instinct warning him to measure this new stranger's trust before handing over his deepest secret twice in the same week. He simply spoke with the flat, weary certainty of someone who'd witnessed exactly what he described, and let her draw her own conclusions about how he'd come to know it. Morgana listened without interrupting, her expression cycling slowly from skepticism through something closer to grim recognition, not unlike the same shift Setsuna had watched cross Dan's face days earlier. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, studying him with new intensity, before she said that she'd heard whispers of a stirring evil for some years now, carried on old currents of magic she still monitored from this cave despite having withdrawn from the wider world generations ago. She'd hoped, she admitted, that the whispers were only old fears resurfacing rather than genuine warning. She said his account troubled her more than she wanted to show 3 teenagers standing uninvited in her cavern. Drago, sensing the weight of the conversation shifting somewhere well beyond his understanding, asked, half-joking again, whether this meant they were getting the contract or not. Morgana's expression softened slightly at that, something almost fond crossing her ancient features, and she said the boy asking about spirit contracts would need to prove himself worthy first, through trials that had broken far older applicants than him, and that she made no promises about outcomes she couldn't yet predict. She turned and led them toward the cottage, gesturing for Isla and Drago to wait outside near a small stone bench beside the door. Since the trials, she explained, tested only the one seeking the bond, and additional witnesses tended to complicate the process in ways that rarely helped anyone involved. Leela caught Setsuna's arm before he followed the witch inside, her expression tight with worry she didn't bother hiding anymore. She asked if he actually understood what he was walking into, since Morgana's tone made the trials sound like something considerably more dangerous than an academy exam. Setsuna told her, honestly, that he didn't fully understand it either, only that it was necessary, and that necessary things rarely came without risk attached. She held his gaze a moment longer, then nodded slowly, releasing his arm with obvious reluctance, and told him, quietly, that he'd better walk back out of that cottage in one piece, because she hadn't spent weeks patching his knuckles just to lose him to some ancient witch's basement. He managed a small, genuine smile at that, the first real one he'd allowed himself since the previous night's confrontation with Leo, and told her he intended to hold her to that. Inside, the cottage proved larger than its modest exterior suggested, the single round window somehow admitting far more light than a cave chamber should allow, and at its center stood a wide, circular basin carved directly into the stone floor, filled with water so still and dark it looked less like liquid than a window into somewhere else entirely. Morgana gestured toward the basin and explained, in the same unhurried, musical voice, that the trial required Setsuna to descend into a reflection of his own deepest fear or regret, and remain whole enough of mind to climb back out again. Those who failed, she said plainly, either drowned in memories not strong enough to survive reliving, or emerged from the water permanently changed in ways that rarely improved a person. Setsuna asked how many applicants over the centuries had actually succeeded. Morgana's answer came quiet and precise, carrying the weight of every failure she'd personally witnessed across 300 years of guarding this place. She said the number, out of considerably more attempts than he'd probably guess, could be counted on one hand. Setsuna stepped toward the basin without letting himself hesitate long enough to reconsider. Morgana warned him once more before he knelt at its edge, her voice softer now than it had been outside, almost gentle. She said the water didn't choose kindly. It found whatever wound sat deepest and least healed, and made him live inside it again, fully, without the mercy of knowing beforehand it was already over. Setsuna told her he understood, though some part of him suspected understanding a warning and surviving what it described were two very different things. He lowered his hands into the dark water first, testing it the way a soldier tests unfamiliar ground, and felt nothing except a faint, pulling cold that seemed to reach past his skin towards something underneath it. Morgana nodded once, satisfied, and told him the rest would come whether he was ready or not. He closed his eyes and let himself sink forward. The world dissolved around him, the cottage and the basin and the ancient witch all fading into a formless dark that lasted only a heartbeat before resolving into somewhere else entirely, somewhere small and familiar, in a way that hit harder than any battlefield memory ever had. He stood in a narrow room lit by a single guttering candle, walls lined with patched blankets instead of proper insulation, the unmistakable smell of the orphanage he'd grown up in this life pressing in around him before his mind fully registered where he'd landed. A younger version of himself, no older than 6, sat curled in the corner of a thin cot, watching a woman pace the small room with increasingly frantic steps. Setsuna recognized her instantly, though he hadn't let himself think about her directly in longer than he cared to admit. His mother. Thinner than he remembered, her eyes hollow with an exhaustion that had nothing to do with sleep. He knew, with the sick certainty of someone watching a memory rather than living it fresh, exactly which night this was. The war had already begun by then, in the world outside, distant enough from their small village that news arrived only in rumors and refugee wagons, but close enough that supplies had dried up, that fear had settled into every household like damp rot. His mother had lost her own husband to a border skirmish 2 years earlier. She'd lost her position at the local mill when the owner fled toward the capital. She'd spent that final winter watching her only son grow thinner by the week while she found less and less to feed him. The younger Setsuna, small and frightened in the corner, asked her quietly why she was crying. She didn't answer him directly. She knelt instead and gathered him into her arms, holding him tighter than usual, murmuring something soft and broken about how sorry she was, how she couldn't watch him starve slowly the way the neighbor's boy had, how she loved him more than anything else the war had left her. Setsuna, watching from outside the memory with the full weight of adult understanding his younger self never had, recognized the shape of what came next a full second before it happened, and the recognition didn't make it any easier to witness. She reached for the small kitchen knife resting on the table, her hand shaking so badly the blade rattled against the wood. The younger Setsuna, sensing something wrong in the way her arms tightened, asked in a small voice whether they were going to be okay. She said, through tears that had turned into something closer to a wail, that they would be together, that it wouldn't hurt, that she just wanted the fear to stop, for both of them, all at once. Setsuna watched her raise the knife with trembling hands, watched his younger self go rigid with confused terror, and felt something in his chest tear open even though he already knew, distantly, that this hadn't been how the story actually ended. At the last possible instant, her hand stopped. She stared down at the blade, at her own son's frightened face beneath her, and something broke in her expression that had nothing to do with despair anymore. She dropped the knife like it had burned her, and instead pulled him close again, sobbing apologies into his hair, telling him she was sorry, so sorry, that she'd never do that she would find another way even if it killed her trying. The memory blurred forward without transition, the way dreams sometimes skip the parts too painful to linger on, landing him in a different night only weeks later. The small room now lit by firelight from outside rather than a single candle. Shouting carried through the thin walls. The village was burning at its edges, raiders taking advantage of the war's chaos to pick over an undefended settlement. His mother didn't hesitate this time. She grabbed him by the hand, pulled him from the cot, and ran. Setsuna, watching himself run through smoke-choked streets in his mother's grip, remembered fragments of this night from his own actual memory, pieces he'd buried so deep he'd almost convinced himself they belonged to someone else's story. The screaming, the heat. His mother's hand, impossibly strong, dragging him through an alley too narrow for the raiders' horses to follow. They reached the edge of the burning village just as 3 riders cut off the path ahead, torches raised, laughing the ugly laughter of men who'd stopped seeing villagers as people worth sparing. His mother didn't run from them. She turned instead, put herself squarely between the riders and her son, and told Setsuna, in a voice gone suddenly calm and clear despite everything, to run for the orphanage on the hill and not look back no matter what he heard behind him. He hadn't listened, not entirely, not back then, and not now watching it again. He'd made it only a few dozen steps before turning around despite her instructions, small and desperate to see her following him. She wasn't following. She was standing exactly where she'd stopped, unarmed, exhausted, a woman with nothing left to fight with except herself, buying every second she could against 3 armed men so her son could disappear into the dark. Setsuna, both the memory's small, frightened version of himself and the older version watching from somewhere outside time, saw the same thing at the same moment. One of the rider's torches came down. She didn't scream the way he'd always imagined she might have. She simply went still, all at once, and stayed that way. The memory didn't let him look away. It held him there, in the smoke and the firelight, watching his 6-year-old self stand frozen at the edge of a burning street, watching his mother's body illuminated by torchlight that no longer moved. He remembered, with brutal clarity now, exactly how long it had taken the orphanage matron to find him wandering half a mile from the village afterward, mute with shock, unable to explain what he'd seen for nearly a week. The water around him surged, cold and sudden, and Setsuna understood, distantly, that this was the moment the trial demanded something more than simply enduring the memory. Understanding was not the same as surviving it. He let himself feel the whole weight of it, the guilt he'd never fully examined even across 2 lifetimes, the quiet, corrosive thought that had followed him for years afterward, that if he'd only run faster, or not turned around, or somehow been strong enough as a child to help her instead of hide, she might have lived. He let the thought sit in his chest, sharp and unbearable, and then, deliberately, he set it down. Not because it stopped hurting, because he finally understood, standing in the reflection of his own worst night with the perspective an entire second lifetime had given him, that a 6-year-old boy running from 3 armed raiders was never the failure in that story. The failure belonged to the war itself, to the men who burned an undefended village, to every larger, crueler force that had put a mother in a position where dying to buy her son a few dozen extra steps was the only choice left available to her. He hadn't failed her by surviving. He'd honored the entire reason she'd stood between him and those riders in the first place. The water accepted that understanding the way a lock accepts the correct key, releasing its hold on the memory all at once, and Setsuna felt himself pulled backward through darkness, out of the burning village, out of his own 6-year-old grief, back toward the surface of Morgana's ancient basin. He broke through the water gasping, soaked to the skin, kneeling on the cottage's stone floor with his hands braced against the basin's edge and his whole body shaking with the aftershock of grief he'd carried silently for far longer than either of his 2 lifetimes combined. Morgana knelt beside him, saying nothing at first, simply resting a steadying hand on his shoulder until his breathing settled into something approaching normal. When he could finally speak, his voice came out rougher than he expected. He asked if that had actually happened, or if the basin had simply invented the cruelest possible version of a night he barely remembered. Morgana's expression, when he looked up at her, held something gentler than he'd seen from her yet, an old sorrow layered over genuine sympathy. She told him the basin didn't invent anything. It only showed a person the truth their own mind had buried too deep to face voluntarily. Exactly as it happened, no more and no less. Setsuna sat with that for a long moment. The weight of finally, truly remembering his mother's final night settling into something he could carry, rather than something that carried him. A soft warmth bloomed faintly in the air above the basin then, small and flickering, resolving slowly into a shape no larger than a house cat, wreathed in gentle flame, that somehow scorched nothing it touched. Two tiny points of ember-orange light blinked open where its eyes should be, regarding Setsuna, with an expression that managed to look thoroughly unimpressed, despite having no discernible face structure at all. Morgana, watching the small flame creature with clear surprise of her own, told him quietly that very few applicants ever earned a spirit's attention on their very first trial, and fewer still earned one this quickly. The little fire spirit drifted closer, circling Setsuna's soaked shoulders once, and spoke in a voice far more arrogant than its tiny size suggested it had any right to carry, informing him bluntly that it had watched him relive his own worst memory and set it down properly, instead of drowning in self-pity like most of the pathetic mortals who came sniveling through that basin, and that this, apparently, made him marginally less boring than the last several centuries of applicants combined. Setsuna, still catching his breath, managed a tired, surprised laugh at the sheer condescension packed into something the size of a house cat. The spirit introduced itself as Blazer, informed him that the contract bonding them would require nothing further than his continued willingness to not embarrass it in combat, and settled onto his shoulder with the proprietary comfort of something that had apparently already decided this arrangement was permanent, regardless of what Setsuna thought about it. Morgana rose to her feet, studying the newly formed bond with quiet satisfaction, and told him that the fire spirit's contract marked only the beginning of what remained available to someone determined enough to survive the deeper trials waiting further into these mountains. Water, wind, earth, and rarer elements still, each guarded by trials crueler than the one he'd just endured. She warned him, gently but firmly, that today's success bought him nothing beyond today. Each spirit demanded its own reckoning, its own buried truth dragged into the light before it granted its power. And some of those truths, she suspected, watching him carefully now, would prove considerably harder to set down than a 6-year-old's grief over a mother he couldn't save. Setsuna nodded, exhaustion and something close to peace settling over him in equal measure, and told her he intended to come back for every single one of them, whatever the cost turned out to be. Outside, Isla and Drago were on their feet the moment the cottage door opened, twin expressions of relief crossing their faces at the sight of him upright and breathing, though both froze slightly at the small flame creature perched smugly on his shoulder. Drago asked, with the particular caution of a man who'd learned not to underestimate strange magic anymore, whether the tiny fire thing was friendly or about to set someone's hair on fire. Blazer answered before Setsuna could, informing Drago with considerable disdain that it only burned things that deserved burning, and that his hair, regrettably, did not currently qualify. Ila laughed despite herself, some of the tension finally draining from her shoulders, and asked Setsuna, more gently, whether he was actually all right. He told her honestly that he would be, that the trial had cost him something he'd been avoiding for a very long time, but that setting it down properly felt better than he'd expected it to. She studied his face a moment longer, apparently satisfied by whatever she found there, and told him that whatever the trial had shown him, she was glad he'd come back through that door in one piece, exactly as she'd made him promise. The walk back down the mountain took longer than the climb up, weighted by exhaustion and the quiet, private processing each of them needed after a day that had asked more of all three of them than any of them expected. Blazer complained the entire way about the indignity of walking distances a proper spirit shouldn't have to endure, though it made no move to leave Setsuna's shoulder regardless. By the time they reached the academy gates as evening settled over the campus, Setsuna felt lighter than he had in longer than he could remember, carrying both a new, arrogant companion and a grief finally faced rather than buried. He didn't yet know that somewhere beneath the Academy's own dungeon ranges, an undead professor's twisted experiments were already stirring something far larger and far hungrier than any trial basin's imagined fears, something that would demand this same new fire against a threat with very real teeth. That confrontation, unlike the quiet reckoning he'd just survived, was still waiting to happen. It found him barely a week later. The Academy required all combat track students to complete a supervised dungeon clearance before the term's end, a graded exercise meant to test practical application rather than classroom theory. For most departments, the assigned dungeons were shallow, well-mapped, thoroughly picked over by generations of prior students. The close combat department, predictably, had been assigned the Academy's oldest and least maintained site. A sprawling ruin beneath the eastern hills that hadn't been properly surveyed in over a decade. Professor Grimsley, the supervising instructor for the exercise, met Setsuna's small group at the ruin's entrance with a checklist and an air of distracted impatience, the kind of academic more interested in filing paperwork than actually walking the tunnels himself. He assigned Drago, Ila, and Setsuna to the Western Passage, muttered something about outdated maps being close enough for government work, and retreated to a folding chair near the entrance to wait out the exercise from a comfortable distance. Ila commented, once he was out of earshot, that Grimsley hadn't set foot inside a dungeon himself in at least 2 academic terms, and it showed in how carelessly he'd assigned the routes. Setsuna filed the observation away without much concern at the time. It would matter more than any of them expected before the day was finished. The Western Passage descended through crumbling stonework clearly older than the Academy itself. Ancient support pillars cracked and leaning, the air thick with a mineral dampness that spoke of long, undisturbed depths. Blazer, riding on Setsuna's shoulder, complained almost immediately about the lack of proper lighting, producing a small, floating orb of flame to illuminate their path more out of spite than helpfulness. They cleared 2 minor chambers without incident, dispatching a handful of the same pale, hunched creatures Setsuna had encountered in Morgana's cavern, before the passage opened into a chamber unlike anything the outdated maps had indicated existed. The chamber stretched far larger than any reasonable dungeon room should, its ceiling lost in darkness even with Blazer's flame pushed to its brightest glow, and at its center sat a wide, stagnant lake. Black water utterly still except for the occasional slow ripple breaking its surface from something moving beneath. Drago, eyeing the water warily, asked whether the old maps mentioned anything about an underground lake this size. Setsuna admitted they didn't, which told him, with the flat certainty of old battlefield instinct, that something had changed down here recently enough that the Academy's records hadn't caught up. A figure emerged from the shadows along the chamber's far wall before any of them could decide how to proceed, robed in the tattered remains of an Academy professor's formal attire, skin gray and desiccated, eyes burning with a faint, sickly green glow that had nothing living behind it. Ila's breath caught audibly. She recognized the robes, if not the ruined face wearing them, as belonging to Professor Halvard, an instructor from the summoning department who had officially resigned and left the Academy nearly a year earlier, citing health reasons nobody had questioned very closely at the time. The undead thing that had once been Professor Halvard studied the 3 of them with the patient, unhurried attention of something that no longer felt fear or urgency, and spoke in a voice that rasped like dry paper dragged across stone, informing them that visitors were rare down here, and that his newest creation had grown hungry waiting for a proper test. He raised one withered hand toward the lake, and the water erupted. What surfaced was no ordinary dungeon monster. 3 serpentine necks rose dripping from the black water, each crowned with a skull-like head trailing rotted flesh and exposed bone, eyes burning the same sickly green as their undead masters. The creature's body remained submerged, massive enough that its surfacing alone sent waves crashing against the chamber's stone shore. Drago swore under his breath and asked, with real alarm now, what exactly Halvard had been doing down here for the past year to produce something like that. Halvard, apparently pleased by the reaction, explained with the detached pride of a scholar discussing a successful experiment that he'd spent his exile refining a technique for reanimating and fusing multiple creature corpses into a single superior specimen, a hydra reborn from the bones of 3 separate beasts and bound entirely to his will. He said the Academy's dismissal of his research had only proven, in the end, how short-sighted their institutional caution truly was. The Hydra's 3 heads turned in unison toward the small group, and the nearest one lunged. Setsuna shoved Isla sideways out of the strike's path, felt the rush of displaced air as rotted teeth snapped shut inches from where she'd been standing, and rolled clear himself as the second head came around from the opposite angle, forcing him to abandon any careful positioning in favor of pure reflex. Drago charged the 3rd head head-on, enhancement skill blazing along his forearms, and caught its downward strike on both raised arms, boots skidding backward across wet stone under the sheer weight of the impact. Blazer, still perched on Setsuna's shoulder, complained loudly that fighting something this size without proper fire support was an insult to its abilities, and demanded, with considerable arrogance, that Setsuna finally let it actually do something useful. Setsuna, dodging a 3rd strike from the first head as it recovered, told the spirit he was entirely open to suggestions. Blazer's tiny form flared brighter, heat radiating outward in a way that made the damp chamber air shimmer, and it explained, in between insults about mortal patience, that the bond between them allowed Setsuna to channel its fire directly through his own strikes, rather than relying on the spirit to fight independently, provided he stopped hesitating long enough to actually try it. Setsuna didn't need to be told twice. He closed the distance to the nearest Hydra head as it reared back for another lunge, and instead of his usual bare-knuckle strike, let Blazer's fire pour through his fist the instant before impact. The strike connected with a sound like a furnace door slamming shut, flame erupting along the head's rotted flesh in a bright, hungry blaze that spread instantly through desiccated tissue with nothing left to resist it. The head shrieked, a sound with no proper vocal cords behind it, more felt than heard, and thrashed wildly before collapsing motionless into the shallow water at the shore's edge. Halvard's expression, still visible across the chamber, shifted from detached scholarly interest into something closer to alarm. The remaining two heads redoubled their assault, clearly sensing the threat Setsuna now posed, and Drago found himself struggling to hold his ground against the third head's renewed aggression, sweat pouring down his face from the effort of matching its raw strength. Ila, unable to fight the Hydra directly herself, circled wide instead, healing salve already in hand, watching for an opening to support either of her companions rather than simply standing helpless on the sidelines. Setsuna pressed his advantage against the second head, weaving beneath its strikes with the same patient economy that had carried him through an entire tournament, waiting for the precise opening rather than forcing one prematurely. When it came, a half-second overextension as the head snapped forward too eagerly, he drove a fire-wreathed palm strike directly into the base of its skull, and it collapsed the same way its twin had, flame-consuming rotted flesh with nothing organic left to slow it down. Halvard, watching two-thirds of his prized creation reduced to smoldering ruin in a matter of minutes, abandoned his detached academic composure entirely, shrieking something about ungrateful children destroying years of careful work, and threw himself into the fight directly, gray hands crackling with necrotic energy aimed squarely at Setsuna. Setsuna turned to meet the new threat, Blazer's fire still humming warm through his knuckles, and found Halvard's undead speed considerably slower than a living mage's would have been, decay having cost the creature whatever reflexes it once carried in life. He closed the distance easily, caught the necrotic strike on a raised forearm that stung but didn't break through Blazer's protective warmth, and answered with a single decisive blow that ended the fight as thoroughly as it had ended for both fallen Hydra heads. Halvard's body crumbled the moment the strike connected, whatever dark magic had animated his corpse finally releasing its hold entirely, and with his death, the third and final Hydra head, still locked in combat with Drago, went suddenly, completely still, its animating will severed at the source. Drago staggered back from the now motionless head, breathing hard, and looked across the chamber at Setsuna with an expression somewhere between exhaustion and disbelief. He asked, not for the first time since meeting him, exactly how many more surprises Setsuna intended to keep pulling out of nowhere. Setsuna, catching his own breath while Blazer's flame dimmed back down to its usual small, smug glow, admitted honestly that he'd stopped trying to predict that answer for himself. Ila reached them both a moment later, checking each for injuries with brisk, practiced hands, relief plain across her face despite the chaos still smoking gently around the chamber's shoreline. She asked what they were supposed to tell Professor Grimsley about a dead colleague and a corpse-fused Hydra waiting in a supposedly routine graded exercise. Setsuna considered the question for a moment, glancing back at the ruined chamber, at the evidence of a full year's secret, forbidden research, that the Academy's own carelessness had allowed to fester undetected in supposedly cleared territory. He told her the truth was probably the only option that made sense this time, however uncomfortable it made Grimsley's paperwork. None of them yet realized how far the ripples from that discovery would eventually spread, back through the Academy's administration, into old questions about which other retired professors had left under circumstances nobody had bothered questioning closely enough, and forward, toward a festival celebration back in Setsuna's hometown that would bring a far more dangerous resurrection directly to his own doorstep. The Academy granted its combat track students a brief recess following the dungeon incident, partly to let the administration quietly investigate Professor Halvard's forbidden research, partly because the annual Harvest Festival in Setsuna's hometown fell during the same week. He hadn't planned on attending. 2 lifetimes of loss had taught him to keep his distance from places heavy with memory. But a letter arrived from the orphanage matron herself, asking simply that he come see her before the festival ended. And something in the careful, measured way she'd written it told him this wasn't an ordinary invitation. Isla insisted on coming with him. Drago, muttering about somebody needing to keep an eye on both of them, came too. The orphanage looked smaller than he remembered, weathered by another year of harsh winters, though warm lantern light spilled from its windows as festival music drifted up from the village square below. Deborah met them at the door herself, older and thinner than the woman who'd raised him, her hands trembling slightly around a shawl she hadn't needed indoors before. She asked to speak with him alone, and led him to a small back room where she'd once tended the youngest children through fevers and nightmares. She told him, without preamble, that her health had been failing for months, and that she wanted to say something before she lost the chance. Something she'd carried silently since long before he ever arrived at her door. She confessed that years earlier, before the orphanage, she'd served briefly in the Magus Battalion's support corps, and a costly mistake during a routine supply run had left an entire border village without proper evacuation warning when raiders struck. That village, she said, her voice breaking, had been his. Setsuna sat frozen, the pieces of a grief he'd only just finished setting down in Morgana's basin rearranging themselves around this new, unbearable detail. She explained, haltingly, that she'd been young then, barely older than the students she now cared for, assigned to relay warning signals along the eastern border network. A miscommunication with a senior officer, a signal fire lit an hour too late, had seemed like such a small failure at the time, the kind of mistake buried in a stack of wartime reports and forgotten by everyone except the person who made it. She hadn't known, not for years afterward, which specific village had paid the price for that hour. She'd carried the guilt anyway, formless and directionless, until a routine transfer of war orphans brought a silent, traumatized 6-year-old to her doorstep with a name that matched, finally, a report she'd never stopped rereading in private. She said she'd almost turned him away, out of sheer cowardice, terrified of what raising him might eventually force her to admit. She hadn't been strong enough to send him elsewhere either, not once she saw how frightened and alone he looked standing in her doorway, and so she'd kept him instead, telling herself she would find the courage to confess someday, before it became too late to matter. Setsuna listened to all of it without interrupting, feeling old fault lines shift inside a wound he'd thought, only days earlier, he'd finally learned to carry properly. Deborah wept, saying she'd spent every year since trying to make amends the only way she knew how, taking in every orphan child the war left behind, though nothing could undo the night her failure had orphaned him specifically. Setsuna took her trembling hands in his and told her, with a certainty that surprised them both, that she wasn't the failure in that story any more than his own 6-year-old self had been. He said he'd learned, only recently and at considerable cost, exactly where blame for that night actually belonged, and it wasn't with a frightened young signal officer following orders in a chaotic war, any more than it belonged with a child too small to fight off armed raiders. He called her mom, the word he'd never once used with her before, and thanked her for every year of warmth she'd given a boy with nowhere else to go. She broke down completely at that, and he held her while she cried, the old wound between them finally, gently closing. Their quiet moment didn't last. Shouting erupted from the festival square below, followed by a low, resonant horn blast that silenced the music entirely. Setsuna reached the window in time to see the sky above the square darken unnaturally, shadow pooling downward like ink dropped into water. A figure descended from that shadow, robed in funerary black, wearing a porcelain mask carved into a serene, smiling face, utterly at odds with the horror unfolding beneath it. Ancient graves along the village's edge erupted outward as she raised one hand, and long-dead warriors clawed free of centuries-old soil, animated husks wearing the rusted armor of legendary heroes the village still told stories about. The masked figure introduced herself to the terrified crowd below as Tsukuyomi and said she'd come to test whether living blood could still stand against legends properly reborn. Setsuna reached the square moments later, Drago and Ila close behind him, Blazer already flaring bright with anticipation on his shoulder. The revived warriors fought with the ghost memory of skills earned across real lifetimes, faster and stronger than any dungeon construct, and villagers scattered screaming as 3 of the ancient heroes converged on the fleeing crowd. Drago intercepted the largest of them, a broad-shouldered husk still wearing the rusted crest of a general the village had once celebrated in old harvest songs, and traded blows that shook loose centuries of packed grave dirt with every impact. Setsuna threw himself between the remaining warriors and the villagers, Blazer's fire wreathing his fists, trading blows against reflexes clearly drilled through actual combat rather than crude reanimation. One husk fell to a fire-wreathed strike that finally, permanently ended whatever restless echo of soul the reanimation had dragged back into its bones. The other pressed him hard, forcing him backward step by step across cobblestones slick with spilled festival wine and worse. Ila fought at his side for the first time as an equal rather than support, driving back a lesser husk with desperate, improvised technique, fear and determination tangled together across her face, her earlier tournament training finally proving useful outside a controlled academy ring. Tsukuyomi watched the chaos with detached amusement from above, until Setsuna finally broke through to her, and she met his assault personally, her porcelain mask never once cracking even as he landed blows that would have staggered any ordinary opponent. She caught his final strike inches from her masked face, strength far beyond a normal mage's, and told him, almost gently, that a regressor's stolen decade of practice still wasn't enough against something that had never truly died in the first place. She drove him back hard, and in the opening that followed, one of the ancient warriors turned toward Ila instead, its rusted blade coming down before Setsuna could cross the distance to stop it. Ila didn't dodge fast enough. The blade caught her across the side, and she went down hard, blood spreading dark across the festival cobblestones, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Setsuna's world narrowed to nothing except reaching her, Blazer's fire erupting in a wide, desperate arc that scattered the nearest husks into scorched debris, and he fell to his knees beside her, hands pressed uselessly against a wound too deep for ordinary pressure to help. Ila's eyes found his, glassy with pain, and she managed a weak, stubborn smile, telling him she'd told him she'd better see him walk through that basin door, and he'd better return the favor now. Something in Setsuna broke open at that, raw and desperate. Memories of every ally he'd failed to save in his first life, crashing against the very real possibility of losing her now. A soft blue light answered that desperation, rising unbidden from the festival's ornamental fountain nearby, coalescing into a shape both delicate and immense, water-given form and quiet, ancient sorrow. The water spirit regarded Ila's failing body and Setsuna's raw, unguarded grief, and spoke in a voice like rain against glass, saying it had watched countless mortals beg for power out of ambition or fear, but rarely, in all its long existence, had it witnessed love this plain and this selfless, offered without a single thought of personal gain. It touched Ila's wound, and warm light spread through the injury, closing torn flesh and stilling the panicked rhythm of her breathing. Ila gasped, color returning to her face as the wound sealed beneath the spirit's touch, and stared up at the shimmering water-formed presence hovering above her with wide, disbelieving eyes. The water spirit told her, gently, that her bond with the boy beside her had earned this contract more thoroughly than any trial basin ever could, and settled its power into her the way morning mist settles over still water, quiet and complete. Tsukuyomi, watching the exchange from above, tilted her masked head with something like genuine interest, and said this development changed matters considerably, before withdrawing her remaining husks back into shadow and retreating skyward, leaving the festival square scattered with scorched grave soil and stunned, grateful survivors. Setsuna helped Ila to her feet, her hand trembling in his, both of them shaken but alive, and somewhere behind them, Deborah watched from the orphanage doorway with tears on her face that had nothing to do with old guilt anymore. The village took most of that night to settle, healers moving between minor injuries while a shaken town council argued over what, exactly, to tell the crown about an apostle raising legendary dead in the middle of a harvest festival. Setsuna gave what account he could without revealing everything he knew, Dan's earlier caution about secrecy still fresh in his mind. Though he suspected the days of keeping Vidrak's servants entirely hidden from the wider kingdom were numbered, regardless of anyone's preference. Drago, nursing a scraped shoulder from his fight with the general's husk, found Setsuna near the edge of the square once the worst of the chaos had settled, and asked, with none of his usual joking tone, whether this was simply what Setsuna's life looked like now. Monsters, apostles, ancient witches, world-ending gods, one after another with barely time to breathe between them. Setsuna admitted it was, and that it would likely only grow stranger from here, and told Drago, honestly, that he was grateful to have people willing to stand beside him through it regardless. Ila, still adjusting to the quiet new presence of the water spirit settled somewhere beneath her skin, leaned against his shoulder as the festival's scattered lanterns burned low around them, and said, softly, that whatever came next, ancient gods included, she intended to be standing right there beside him when it arrived. He didn't tell her, that night, how much that promise meant to a man who'd once watched everyone he loved die in a single doomed formation. He simply let himself, for one quiet moment, believe that this time, in this second chance he'd bled and regressed and grieved to earn, it might actually be true.